Prime Minister Trudeau today met with the head of Canada's major steel producer, Stelco Inc. of Hamilton, and on the agenda were two subjects which overshadow everything else when it comes to steel in Canada: the 9-month-old U.S. tariffs imposed by Donald Trump on Canadian steel and aluminum, and the compensation that's been promised by the federal government to help tide the industry over until those tariffs are lifted. Last week, Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland announced that the Canadian Parliament won't be asked to ratify the new NAFTA agreement with the U.S. until the tariffs are lifted. The standoff is taking its toll, and it shows no sign of ending soon. Joining me now to discuss it all is Mark Agnew. He's the Senior Director of International Policy for the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, let's start with what you represent steel and aluminum producers across the country. What's their sense? Because everyone is trying to get a sense of whether these steel and aluminum tariffs are anywhere near being lifted by the United States. What's their sense of it?
Well, I wish I could come here bearing gifts of good news, but I think the unfortunate reality from everything we're hearing in Washington and very much seeing in the news seems to indicate that we're going to be in this for a little while still. The U.S. administration has a very ideological approach to this. Managed trade is the way that they view the world and the direction they want us to go down. So unfortunately, I can't come here saying that it's going to get resolved certainly by this afternoon by any means.
And even just weeks ago, we still saw positive comments from Donald Trump that he likes the fact that he's making money on tariffs and all that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. What about how much is the industry hurting? How much is it costing the industry in terms of what they pay on both sides of the border?
Well, I don't have sort of a dollar and cents figure for how much all of our members are paying, collectively, but certainly the government would be well aware of that. But it's no, chump change from what I hear from our members, at least anecdotally. These are companies that have integrated supply chains, moving products across the border, every day, truckloads and truckloads of this, and we're talking fairly large sums of money. And again, the fact that we're now at a point where you've probably whittled through the stock that you may have had in the run-up to the tariffs means you can't avoid these things any longer, unfortunately.
Now, Chrystia Freeland has said that Canada's position now is going to be that we're not going to ratify NAFTA 2 until we get some kind of lifting of these tariffs. What do you make of that position in terms of producers, in terms of the Chamber of Commerce, supportive of that position?
Yeah, I think that entirely makes sense. What you're looking at right now in the U.S. Congress is the Democrats who control the House of Representatives are making demands, and it's not entirely clear if it means, opening the agreement is a side letter that perhaps can satisfy them. But when we're thinking about ratification here, we need to know what agreement it is that we are actually ratifying at the end of the day. So until the U.S. has its act sorted out and the Congress and the administration know what they want to do, there's really no point in us rushing ahead with ratification. But that doesn't mean we sit on our hands at the same time. There's the steel and aluminum tariff issue, and that should really be the focus of us right now at the moment.
I was talking to an observer last Friday from Washington, Laura Dawson, and she suggested that given that NAFTA 2 is not going to be ratified anytime soon, and that will be, by all estimates, after the next Canadian election. She said the Canadian government is just as well to sit on his hands, wait this out. You say because we want to find out what exactly NAFTA 2 is, but also because there doesn't seem to be any currency in it for us to pass NAFTA if they don't seem to be linking the tariffs with NAFTA.
Yeah, and I think when you're looking at what we should be doing in the United States, I think, there's a very clear case to be made that Canadian exports of steel and aluminum are not national security threats to the U.S. And the whole ostensible justification for these tariffs is that they are somehow a national security risk. What was interesting is that there's a study that was put out by an institute in the United States looking at the exclusion process. So these are companies that have gone to the Department of Commerce and said, we want our products getting an exemption from the national security tariffs. And what's interesting actually is China has gotten more exemptions than Canadian companies have in this process. So to me, that sort of undercuts the whole argument that there's a national security risk. And what we actually should be doing is saying to the Americans, let's work with you to tackle the root causes of global overproduction in steel and aluminum, working at the OECD, the G20, the G7, and other forums to really push this issue and tackle, as I said, the root causes of it rather than fighting each other.
How can that's mind-boggling? How can that be that China, which this is supposedly all about, the U.S. complaining that China is flooding the world market of steel, that they get more exemptions to allow direct import without tariffs of Chinese steel in the United States?
Well, I'm not sitting in the U.S. Commerce Department, so I can't give you the answer. If I knew, I'd probably be doing something different right now. You'll have to have Wilbur Ross on as your next guest to give you the answer to that question.
Okay. What about what's the point that's been made is that the only thing we still have is just the lobbying effort. And I know the Canadian Chamber of Commerce has been working arm in arm, hand in hand with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. But we've been told that for a year. It's been a year now, a very heavy, intense lobbying. We saw Canadian politicians politicians going down before the signing of NAFTA too.
Yeah.
Does the lobbying effort continue? And how do we get anywhere if we're continuing to pull on this full court press and yet we see no evidence yet?
Well, I think what you're starting to see is actually more and more of the U.S. business community being willing to speak out about the impact of these of the tariffs that are being put on American businesses. Okay. And it's not just the people in, say, the steel and aluminum sector who might perhaps, or I guess downstream producers who use Canadian steel and aluminum, but you even have voices in perhaps the agriculture and other sectors that are being hit by the retaliatory tariffs as well, that are saying, this is really hurting us. And I think the role for Canadian businesses is making sure that the case is made to U.S. businesses so that they're going right to their legislatures in Congress and elsewhere and saying this is an issue that has to be fixed now.
What about compensation? The other side of this issue is compensation. The federal government 9 months ago already promised some $2 billion worth, like a massive promise in terms of a strategic development innovation fund. There's been a whole myriad of different programs that have been announced, some rolled out, some not. Is the money flowing? Is any of it making its way to Canadian producers? Do you have any indication that the money is flowing?
It's flowing, but I think what we're hearing is that it's definitely not going to be quick enough for what people would like to see, understandably. And as I say, too, it's not even just on the programs that the government has, but even companies that are seeking so-called a remission or a relief from the retaliatory tariffs. There's concerns also about resourcing in terms of processing those applications, and again, as timely a manner as companies would like. And particularly for SMEs, if you're talking to a small business, the person who does the relief application is probably the same person who's doing HR, which is the same person who's doing payroll and perhaps 6 other jobs in the company. And so you need to make sure that this process is being as friendly as possible for a small business as it is for a large business that has the resources to put that process through.
Is there a concern that some of this compensation, they won't be seeing it by the time the tariffs come off? So in other words, they may have basically swallowed a certain economic hit, and the tariffs come off, and then the compensation may not flow.
Well, I don't think so much that's the concern. I think it's more kind of in the here and now. And again, if I can go back to the example of a small business, I mean, you're probably going to have cash flow constraints if you're waiting on this money to come through that you've applied through the exclusion process.
Now, the government did announce some immediate, I understand one of the small and medium-sized business ones did announce some freeing up immediately. I think it was $317 million or something like that. Yeah. Are they seeing any of that money?
Again, I think it is coming out, but not as quick as businesses would like. And again, to go back to the example, if you're a small business, you have capacity constraints within your organization to be able to do this and to fill out all the paperwork. The check doesn't just show up out of nowhere in the mail. Chamber
of Commerce, are you optimists? Are you cautiously optimistic? I mean, everyone's still trying to figure out where we stand on this and how long it's going to be.
Our view is that we're in this for the long haul, and I think we shouldn't expect that this is going to be done in the immediate term. We really have to think about what is the approach that we're going to take, which will minimize the economic uncertainty and the economic pain for Canadian companies. And it's a discussion that we have to have on an ongoing basis with the government. And I think when we have those discussions, it needs to be done with a longer-term perspective, because it's not clear to me that the U.S. Congress is going to get this done, unfortunately, anytime soon.
Okay, Mark Agnew, thank you very much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.